I am the head of product marketing here at Convey, and I'm going to be just helping out with arbitrating some questions and everything. And I am very excited to introduce David Tucker, who is the VP of Experience Technology at Universal Mind. And we were lucky enough to be joined by David last week for the webinar where we looked at the DisArt Festival application that they created. And this week we're going to be doing more of a technical deep dive. And David's going to walk us through that. So, David, thank you for joining us.
Perfect. Thank you, Caroline. So, as Caroline mentioned, we spent some time last week going over the DisArt Festival app. We're going to kind of extend that a little bit. We'll look a little bit more at some of the architectural thinking that went behind that application, as well as diving in to specifically talking about the technical side of what we did there, as well as on one of our demo applications for mBaaS, which we call the water cooler messaging app, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And so we're going to kind of use those two experiences as a way to talk about architecting solutions on mBaaS, the advantages that you see as a part of that, and just ways that you can leverage it. So, but again, before we dive too deep into that, because we'll have a lot of things to chat about today, I do just want to give you a brief little bit of information about Universal Mind and about myself, so you kind of understand the perspective that I'm coming to this conversation with. So at Universal Mind, we're a digital transformation agency. We focus on creating compelling experiences and strategies that focus on delivering business value to our clients, and we do that by creating experiences on pretty much anything with a screen. So for us, that could be anything from a traditional desktop application to a web application to mobile applications, smartwatch and wearable applications, from everything from genetics all the way through to traditional consumer loyalty to financial services. So because we have a wide array of experience across a lot of different verticals, it really enables us to bring a unique perspective to the conversations that we have with our clients. And over the years, we've had a chance to do work with a lot of great organizations. And so again, this kind of comes from the collective experience that we've gained. And again, for us, it's not just, hey, we're just technology. It's not that we're just user experience. We handle everything from the initial kind of strategy all the way through designing and deploying the solutions. So again, my specific role is VP of Experience Technology, and what that means in the way that we're structured is I spend a lot of time talking with clients early on in our relationships with them to help them structure these engagements so that they're successful. And then the other side of that coin is I spend time going out and talking at conferences and writing about these kind of solutions that we find are successes with our clients. And over the years, I've had a chance to consult with some great organizations, and I have had a chance to write and speak at a lot of great conferences and publications. And so again, I just tell you that just to say that this comes from a lot of kind of trial and error over the years, and we found things that really tend to work well for our clients, and that's some of the information that I want to share with you today. Now, I want to start out by just giving you a little bit of an application overview of both of the applications that we'll be using as our examples for today. So the first application, if you joined us last week, this will be familiar to you. But the first application is going to be one that we created for the DisArt Festival. Now, the DisArt Festival, just to give a quick summary for those of you who weren't here, was something that happened in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the second half of April of this year, where they had an art exhibit that was focused on not only showcasing the art of individuals with disabilities, but also ensuring that that was accessible to anyone, so that people with disabilities could come and see it. And so we found ways to really create a very accessible experience by leveraging Convey, because we spent very little time obviously having to worry about the back end because we were leveraging Convey. It enabled us to really iterate on the front end and create an experience that was focused, again, for individuals that have disabilities all the way through individuals that don't. And that took a lot of user interviews and research to figure out the best solution. So you can kind of see a little bit of this application here as we go through it. And we'll talk about how Convey factored into this specific application. But the next application that we're going to talk about, we didn't touch on last week, and that's an application called a water cooler that we leveraged internally as a way to showcase how you would build an mBaaS solution for a messaging application. And the reason we did this was, over the last couple of years, we've had several clients come to us looking at basically the need to create an internal messaging application. This has been a huge request. It's happened over and over again, and which is no surprise that within just the overall industry, we've seen success of organizations like Slack and Hall and things like HipChat, although recently Atlassian actually acquired Hall, so those are actually now part of the same product suite. But we've seen a huge spike in this, and so we just said, well, okay, well, if we were going to build an experience like this on top of Convey, how would we do it? And then not only how would we do it, but let's just make all of our learnings, make all the code accessible so people can go in and see how we did it. And so that's what the water cooler application is. And so as we go through and talk about how we leverage Convey with this application, I'll give you a link at the end so you actually can go through and look at all of this code for yourself. And you can see here the application going through. It's very much a traditional messaging application. We'll go through some specifics here in a bit. But before we dive into those, I want to talk about how you think about mBaaS, because I think a lot of individuals look at it and they see value, but they're not really trying to think in that frame of mind, and that can lead to solutions that maybe aren't fully leveraging the capabilities. But let's kind of start from ground zero. And so a few of these things I covered kind of in a non-technical nature in the last webinar, but just to dive in first, let's talk about mBaaS. Again, for those of you that aren't familiar with this term that I'll be using a lot today, again, mBaaS stands for Mobile Backend as a Service. And really, it comes down to the fact of, let's look at all mobile applications and let's figure out what commonalities they have. And so we kind of like to frame it this way. What does a digital touchpoint need? And I'm going to touch on this really from a technical nature here for just a minute. So if you were looking across your organization, let's say you're at a large organization, maybe you manage a suite of mobile applications, or maybe you're at a small organization and you've got a cross-platform application. What do all these touch points have in common? Well, first of all, we're going to know that everything is going to have some aspect of cloud-based data. And this might be something where you say, yeah, we're going to go and maybe we can just take, AWS and set up, DynamoDB or RDS or something like that. We're just going to store our data there. Okay, well, you can do that. But then we're also going to have a concept of files, right? So if we're talking about the messaging application, for example, maybe that's just something simple like the profile pictures. But there's going to have to be some sort of a file store. And sure, you can leverage things like S3 to drop those in. But then we're going to have to start getting into the concept of a user. And so there's going to have to be some middle tier work here to really begin to integrate what needs to be done to manage this user. What do they have access to? How do they manage their specific settings and those kind of things? And then there's the concept of security that's tied to the user. So within your middle tier, you're going to have a way to say this specific user can access this piece of cloud data and these specific files and can't access other ones. Right? And so now you're beginning to get into a lot of custom middle tier work that's going to happen. And then you're going to have to tie this into the user being able to do things like resetting their password and the like. But in addition to that, you're going to have a combination of real-time messaging, which is going to be different per platform. So in situations where you want to do real-time messaging, right, you're going to have to build out some layer of abstraction in your middle tier so that you can accommodate, for example, both APNS, which is Apple's push notification system, as well as Google's, so that you can support Android. So there's going to have to be some abstraction done there. And then you begin to think about the other side of the coin, which is all the things you need to have some configuration over. First, you need to be able to configure these experiences to act slightly differently depending on the user's context, which can be simple things such as their location. But then you need to be able to add in some layer of configuration, right? So you need to be able to say, hey, when I save a new message, I want to perform this action. And so you need to be able to do that while tying in your existing data and measuring everything from an analytics perspective. So if you had a couple of years or even just a year within your organization and you said, okay, we're going to build up all of this infrastructure and all of this middle tier work to support our end experiences, you certainly could do that. But this is what mBaaS is. mBaaS says, let's look holistically at what the needs are from a technical perspective for a middle tier and then a piece of the client tier that interacts with that. And let's figure out how we can build this once and then have multiple applications leverage this without having to recreate the wheel every time. And that's what leads us to kind of the distinction between the experience and the platform. And we touched on this a little bit last time as well, right? So if you're an organization and you're focusing so much time on building out this platform and continuing to evolve it, you're actually lessening the ability to which you can innovate on the end user experience. So in a perfect world, you would be able to spend a lot of your time focusing on this end user experience, sitting down with users, getting user feedback, and actually continually evolving that. But to do that, you need stability at the platform layer. And this is why we always say that innovation should happen at the experience layer, not the platform layer. And then kind of the subphrase to this would be, because you need stability at the platform layer so that you can evolve at the experience layer. So the platform layer, instead of innovating, this is where you need to maintain, you need to support, and you need to bring that stability. So let's talk a little bit about how we leveraged Convey within both the water cooler app experience as well as with the Disart Festival app. So we're going to start, well, first of all, let me give a little bit of a clarification here, just so you're aware. The code examples that you're going to see, with the exception of the business logic code, they're all going to be in Swift. Now, that might be new for you, but if you've actually programmed in some sort of an ECMAScript language, this is something that shouldn't look too odd to you. It's one of the reasons I chose it. It's a little bit easier to discern rather than something like Objective-C if you haven't worked on iOS before. But the application itself, the water cooler app, was actually built for iOS 8 and above on Swift. And so you can, again, you'll have access to all of this code on GitHub. I'll give you the link at the end. But let's talk first about user management, because I think this is huge, right? So let's just imagine for a second that you needed to build up some aspect of user management within your organization. Let's talk about the steps that you would need to take. So you would need to first, you're going to have to create some sort of a data store, right? Because you're going to need to store kind of the basics. In the beginning, it's going to be a username and password, right? But we know it's not just going to be password, because you're going to have to leverage a hash and a salt, and you're going to have to then integrate in the ability for the user to change that, the way for you to store specific data with the user. Maybe that's just their first name, last name, email. But you're going to have to build up not only the data store, you're going to have to build up some services to check for authentication and to allow the user to configure those things. And so there's going to be quite a bit that goes into this. But that's only a piece of it, right? Because then you're going to have to build in kind of a login and log out mechanism, which is going to have kind of token negotiation between your middle tier and your actual mobile application itself. So you're going to have to build that piece out, build out a secure way on each platform to actually store these tokens and leverage these with your API calls. Then in addition to that, then this is where things get more complex, because then with user management, you also have to begin to tie in the concept of permissions. So as you build out your middle tier layer to access your data, you're going to have to build in a complete permissions layer as well. And then you're going to need to be able to integrate the ability to change permissions on any data object. So user management, even though maybe in the beginning it sounds really simple, and it sounds like, yeah, I can just plug in some open source library here or there to handle certain pieces of this, it doesn't always provide you with the flexibility that you're going to need to create any kind of mobile application that you can imagine. And so one of the great things about Convey was it allowed us to get up and running with the water cooler demo extremely quickly with the user management side. So let's look just a little bit at the application itself. So on the left, first of all, you can see a directory of the individuals that are included. So this, imagine that it's your company. You can open this application and go to a directory and figure out who you want to talk to. Well, this lists on the left, all of the users, and this is obviously a longer list that can scroll, and it gives some basic information about each user. It gives you their name, it gives you their title, it gives you a profile picture, and then you can dive in and get more specific information. Now, on the right is where the user can actually configure their own profile information. So they can go in and enter their first and last name, email address, and title. And again, if this were a full-fledged messaging app that was out in the store, you could certainly add more fields to this. And if it's something that you wanted to add within an organization, you could add in like reporting structure. So you could see that this individual reports to that individual. There's a lot of things you can add, but the point is the user needs to be able to configure that information. So let's begin to dive in and just look a little bit at the code that it actually took to implement some of these features within the application. And first, we'll start with just the sign-up process. So for creating a new user, the great thing is we have a lot of flexibility here for the data that we can store. So one of the things I really like about the user store within Convey is that you can go in and include arbitrary data as well as predefined data. So really all we're saving is their first name and last name, email address, and then we're saving a custom piece of data, which is that title. That isn't one that's included by default, but you can add it in and it gets stored with the rest of the data. And then to actually save that, all you have to do is call a specific method, user with username, and pass in these values. We need to pass in the email, we need to pass in the password, and then we need to pass in these parameters that we define above. And then it goes through and simply creates the user. And we actually have there's a closure that gets called when this is completed. And it'll either return to us an error if, for example, we try to create a user with the same username as someone that already exists, or it'll just return us back the actual user object. And then we can do other things as needed. In this example, actually uploading a profile picture would be an example of that. And we'll look at that more when we talk about the file store. But in reality, if you needed to create an application and you wanted to test out this user management capability, within, let's say, at most an hour, you could sit down and build out a simple form that's email address, first name, last name, and password. And most anyone that has iOS experience could go through and quickly use code like this to create a user. And then you've got a user and you're ready to go. Now, the other thing that's great about Convey is Convey also supports the concept of an anonymous user. So when we created the UICA Disart Festival app, in those cases, we didn't need to specifically create a user and then have the user manage that, but we did need to store some data so that the user's information was persisted beyond just a single use. One great example of that was we allowed the users to define favorites when it came to specific pieces of art within the exhibit. And so in those cases, all we had to do was leverage the anonymous user from Convey. And so it stores some information locally on the device that identifies this as a user. And then you also can promote that user, should there be a desire to, from an anonymous user to a registered user, and still keep the information associated with them. And so here's all the code that we had to leverage again to create the new user. And again, it's very easy to get up and running with. But then it didn't end there, because we needed to be able to pull back all that information for that directory view that I showed you. And the great thing here is the user data within Convey works just like any other collection of data within the data store. So if you create, like we did for the water cooler app, we created a collection of data for messages, and we can query against those, but the user data itself is also a collection. So in this case, we just needed to go in and create an app data store, and in this case, I'm not doing anything fancy with it. Now, you can do more than what I did. For example, you might want to actually cache this data so it's available offline, so that if a user wants to send messages while they're not exactly online, they could do that, and then we could actually build in some mechanisms to send that when they go back online. Chose not to do that here in this example, but first we create this user store, and then to fetch the users, we just query that list by basically passing in a null query, and it will return back to us a list of all the users in the system. And because Convey allowed us to store that arbitrary data as well as predefined data in with the user store, we're able to go in and use things like the title and the profile picture, which aren't included by default, and use that to populate that view. So that was extremely easy to accomplish as well. And again, you can see here that you can leverage the closure system within Swift to just quickly pass in a callback that'll get called here. And it even gives you the ability to do this with a progress block. So if you want to actually provide some sort of identifier to the end user of the process that you're going through to pull this data down, you can do that as well. But here's where I think things start getting really powerful with the user store inside of Convey. So they give you the ability to, with any piece of data, be that, for example, a file that's stored in the file store or a piece of collection data that's in the actual data store for Convey, you can go in and modify the permissions. And all that's done through a class, if you're using the iOS SDK, called KCS metadata. So we're able to go in and create a convenience initializer inside of Swift and pass in the user IDs that we want to have access to it, and then also have another option that allows us to allow the active user to have permission to it. And so you go through and you can set these, first of all, to not be globally readable, not be globally writable, and then we just add these specific user IDs to the readers and the writers of the data. Now, how we used this within the water cooler application was, obviously in a messaging app, the only people that you want to have access to the data for a message is the user that's sending it, and then the user or users that are receiving it. And this is how we enabled that within the application. When we created a new message or a new message thread, we just went through and set these permissions, and then that enabled it at the API layer to enforce those permissions. Again, this is something you could certainly build on your own, but there's a great deal of flexibility in what comes with Convey and the permissions configuration out of the box. And this was something, again, that enabled us to focus really on innovating at that experience layer and not as much worried on building out a complex and flexible permission system in the middle tier. And that's user management. Now the next aspect of this is file store, because most any application is going to have some aspect of a file store. And if there's user-generated content, then there's going to be huge capabilities for the need of having some sort of a file store. So let's look again at the water cooler application just as an example. And here in this example, again, you can see that we have the concept of a profile picture. Now, we could have actually grown this to be even more. So I actually started the process of integrating this in so that we could do picture messaging and video messaging in this application as a demo. That wouldn't have been too hard to add, but I just ended up not adding that in because there were a few complications just on the UI layer with that would need to be tackled. So I decided to not drop that in, but we could have certainly leveraged that, and we would have leveraged the file store in exactly the same way. We would have leveraged it so that we could store these things there, and then we could use the file store to actually download those, potentially cache those locally, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But we also leveraged it with the Convey application that we did for the DisArt Festival, because in this case we needed to be able to store things such as the artist image. We needed to be able to store the image for each of the artists in their bios and for all of the specific works of art. We also needed to store the audio files that were being used for the artist bios as well, because we made a lot of this content to where it can just be read to you as opposed to having to physically read it on the screen because of our focus on accessibility. And so in all these cases, we leverage the Convey file store with the proper permissions to do this. So let's look at how we actually went through the process of saving the profile pictures from the water cooler app actually to the Convey file store. So if we go in and look at this one method, this was actually a method that gets called after we successfully create a user. We went through and actually uploaded this profile picture. And so we take the UI image, which is just the default iOS SDK type, and we actually can do a few things to it. We have to do some iOS-specific things, such as creating a JPEG representation of that data. But then we go through and we leverage that KCS metadata again. And here, because we want the profile pictures to be accessible by everyone, we set it so that it's globally readable by everyone. But here's the great thing as well. We also can set that by default. It's only writable by the user that created it. And so we also want to keep that as the default because we don't want, for example, someone else to be able to change my profile picture within the app, even at the API layer. So that, again, that's enforced at the API layer. The last thing we have to do is create just a simple parameters dictionary, defining the MIME type, and then passing in that metadata for the permissions. And then we just can upload the data. And again, this is a very simple process in that we just pass in a closure, a completion closure here, and we also have access to a progress block here. So this is certainly a situation where you could present a progress bar to the end user within the application, showing them the process of actually uploading this data. And if that were it, it would still be a very powerful file store. But there's even more to it than that. So one of the things you also can do is you can actually leverage a cache for this information. So we really only wanted to be able to download the profile pictures when they change. We really don't want to have to go through and continually download these profile pictures because that's a fair amount of space, even though, and I didn't include this code because it's not relevant to Convey, we're actually shrinking the image from when the user took that picture. We're shrinking it a little bit to be a smaller size so it doesn't take up a huge amount of space. But even then, you don't want to be downloading it continually. So we leveraged a feature within the Convey file store that allows us to actually check, and as we download a file, we only want to download it again if it's newer than the version that we have locally. So you can see that we actually define that. First, I want to point out here, you can see that we're getting the picture ID back from this custom value that we set on the user. So we have get value for attribute that we're calling. We have a constant defined for this profile picture ID field. Then we're pulling that down, and then if it's defined, we're going and grabbing it from the file store. And by passing in the option here, the KCS file only if newer, then that allows us to ensure that we're only downloading it if it's newer than the value that we have locally. Now I've also added in some different things here. We ended up doing a little bit of a temporary cache that actually exists in memory solely because of the way that we're actually rendering some of the views within iOS. We wanted to prevent there from being any flickering as we presented new views. So there's a few things we did to accommodate that are more specific to iOS. But again, all the file store and all the caching that's actually done at the convey layer worked perfectly fine, and it was something that really enabled us to move pretty quickly and to also limit the amount of data that we're having to continually download over the wire. So next, let's talk a little bit about data modeling, because I think this is one area where a lot of individuals can get tripped up with convey if they haven't had experience with it. And I think this also is a challenge because there's so much you can do with convey from the client-side layer that I think if an individual is not a full-stack developer, they might need a little bit of coaching on how to properly set up your data model within convey. And so this is an area where there's some great blog posts and some great documentation that the team provides. I would encourage everyone to kind of read through that. But I'm going to give a little bit of insights into what we went through with the water cooler application. So here in the demo app, we really only have two collections of data. We have the concept of a message thread, which contains a lot of messages. And the message threads need to be able to be loaded when we present the first view to the end user. This is where you're going to see a list of everybody that you're having conversations with, and it's going to be sorted by the most recent conversation at the top. Then we need to be able to have the information about that user, and that's what we're going to use to actually populate their name and their profile picture. And then we need to have the information about the latest message, and that's how we're going to populate this text that is under their name, as well as the date and time that's displayed at the top right of each of those table cells. Then if we look over at the message itself really just contains who the sender was and then each piece of text associated with that. And again, as I mentioned, this could easily be expanded to accommodate more than just text. You can include pictures, you can include videos, and this could even be expanded to allow for multiple users. You could have group conversations. But for now, we kept the relationships relatively basic so that we could actually just demonstrate these core principles. Now, you can go in. One of the great features, and we talked about this last week as well, one of the great features about convey is the data console. The ability to go in and see all the data for a collection, to look at all the metadata that's associated with it, including its ACL list, and be able to go in and actually modify those values in real time if you want to. And if we go in and look, this actually shows the messages collection in the console. And one of the things that we also can see as we dive through this is understanding how convey represents relationships within this data. So if I go over to the message threads collection, for example, I can go in here and see that we keep a reference to the last message. So the reason that we do this is so that when we load our message threads, we don't actually have to have it actually cascade down and load in all of the pieces of data that are associated with the message thread. There's actually a way that we modeled it so that it can be a little bit more efficient than maybe the way it normally would be modeled. But all convey does to actually store this reference is it actually creates a JSON structure that is of type convey ref and then just includes the ID and the collection name of the collection that you're mapping the relationship to. And then there has to be some configuration that's actually done in the model classes in your client tier. But that actually is not a huge amount of work to do as well. It's actually, once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy to set up. So if you look here at this example, this is actually for the message thread class object itself. You actually can see here that we have three methods that are defined. And the first one is generally going to be defined irrespective of whether or not we have complex relationships that are defined. And that is the host to convey property mapping. This is just where you need your model class to be able to tell convey how to map the name of properties that are in your class to the name of properties that are actually defined in the convey data store. And there's some constants that are leveraged there for things like the KCS entity key metadata and entity key ID. But then the next method is where we really start defining how we map different relationships together. So you can see here in the convey property to collection mapping function, we map the last message property to the messages collection type. So the collection type is actually defined in the data store as messages. And so here it tells us that this property, and it's a single property, it's not an array, is going to be mapped to messages. Then we have one final step, which is the convey object builder options function, which is how we actually go in and we map this last message property to a specific class type. So we know that messages is the collection, but we need to know when we create new instances of that, what class should it use? And that's what this last method does. And it's actually, the method here that's defined looks maybe a little bit more complex than it should, and that's just because there were, in the initial version of Swift 1.0, there were some errors that came about when you actually collapsed that definition of the two different dictionaries together. You actually could write that a little bit more simply than it is right there. But that's how we combine those data relationships. So I would encourage anyone, if you're starting out on a new project with Convey and you're trying to figure out how to best model your data inside of the platform, there's some great documentation and blog posts that you do need to be sure that you read and understand, because for people that are coming from more of a relational background, they need to understand that the structure is a lot more fluid. And it might be, there's some ways that you can leverage the data that you maybe wouldn't have if you were just modeling for a traditional relational database. And so there's some flexibility that you can add in there. And that brings us to kind of the next topic here, which is the concept of business logic. And I think this is another area where, especially if you have developers that maybe have not been full stack developers, these are some areas that they can get tripped up in the process. And let's talk a little bit about why that is. So let's say we have an application where we have an iOS native application, an Android native application, and then a responsive web application, all of which of these are actually being reflected, are being deployed onto Convey. So in that case, all of these, we have a client-side architecture, and then we actually tie into the services and the data tier, and it seems like everything's working well. But the truth is as we dive in and look at the code, we notice something. All of the actual end platforms, so the iOS native application, the Android native application, and the responsive web application have some logic that's replicated across all three of the platforms. In those cases, that means you're having to do the same thing across three different languages. So for example, one of the things that needs to happen is every time we save a message in the water cooler application, we need to then take that, set it as the last message on the message thread, and then send out a push notification to the users that are associated with that specific message, in most cases just the recipient. Now you could write all of that logic in the iOS native application. You could actually do every single bit of that there by the APIs that Convey exposes. But the truth is if you do it that way, you're going to have to write it once for every single platform. So as you analyze these applications, you begin to notice that this is just repetitive code across these different platforms, and there needs to be a better way to do it. And there is. Convey provides the concept of business logic. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to move this from each of the platforms, decrease the amount of code in each of those platforms, and then actually move this up and include the business logic in your services tier, and remove it from each of those platforms so that you maintain that code once, and it will seamlessly work across each of those other platforms. Well, how does it do that? Well, the way it does that is it actually goes through and it allows you to attach specific hooks. So for example, you can have pre and post save hooks for any of your collection data. So for example, if we want to have something happen, such as sending a push notification after we save a message, we can just add an on-post save hook to our messages collection, and then it will enable us to actually take this and move that logic out of each of the client tiers into this business logic. Now, if you haven't had a chance to work with business logic, it actually is all configured through the Convey console. So you have the ability to go in, and there's a full editor within the console, and you can go in and add in these hooks there. You also can add in custom endpoints. We won't talk about that here, but that is another option that you have. So if you don't want to attach it to any of those hooks for your collections, there are ways that you can just define those custom endpoints that you can call as you need them. But the entire code, including comments, that it took for me to add in this concept of saving the last message and pushing the push notification out to the recipient for this only took about 120 lines of JavaScript code. And again, this is written as Node.js. Now, in the version, when I actually built this application, at the time Convey didn't have the full Node container, but now they actually have the Node container, so there's even more that you can do. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through just these 120-ish lines of JavaScript code that it took for me to integrate this, just to showcase how easy this is. And again, I want to point out, I've done this once. If I were to go and build an Android application that does the same thing as a companion for the water cool app tomorrow, the moment I start saving messages, all of this is still going to work. It's still going to be in play. So again, I've written it once, and it's going to work for any of the platforms that I integrate into it. But if we jump over here to the code, first of all, there's a common method, and Convey pre-populates this for you. In this case, it's onPostSave, and it passes you some information that you'll need, including the request, which is going to include all the information about, in this case, the message that was just saved. Now, there's some modules that are predefined that Convey provides to you, and I'm leveraging 4 of those here. The push module, for obvious reasons, I want to be able to send a push notification, so it enables us to do that. Then the collection access module, this is what enables you to actually be able to access your data store from within business logic. Then a logger module, just to log, and then an async module that's going to allow for some asynchronous task handling. And then I begin to pull some data out of this request. And then I actually need to go through and I need to fetch the recipient. And this is where I began to leverage that collection access. So I can actually go in and query this just like, and this actually, the data is actually stored in a MongoDB. So if you've leveraged basically the Mongo querying mechanism before, it's going to look very, very similar to you. We're just going to go through and query that user collection, and we're going to find the ID of the recipient. And we'll need that because we'll need that in a little bit when we actually send the push notification. But if we move down a little bit, then we need to do what I mentioned earlier, which was we need to update that last message so that when we pull down message threads the next time, the latest message has been updated across all of these. So here we're actually going to find a specific message thread and we're going to modify it. Now, I mentioned earlier that all of references within Convey is just a JSON structure that includes information about the ID and the collection type, and then it has a predefined type of Convey ref. So we're just going to create one of those manually ourselves and insert that back into the message thread that is affected. And so that's a fairly upfront and easy process as well. And you can see here we're leveraging kind of an asynchronous capability, so we actually have a callback that gets passed in here that we actually call when we're finished with the process of updating the latest message. Then we need to do a few other things, right? We need to get this recipient ID. There's some ways that we do that that's specific to the water cooler application that we don't really need to dive into. But then we need to construct the push data. Now here, because we're only dealing with an iOS-based application, we only need to construct the actual push data for Apple push notification service. If we were doing a Google, if we had an Android component as well, and we needed to leverage the Google messaging service, we could also construct that here. But then, once we have all of that in place, then that enables us really to go through and configure the actual push notification to be sent, which in this final callback, you can see that it's defined here that we just call the push.send payload, and we pass in all of that data. Now, here's the great thing, too. Because we actually get the response in, we can actually respond. If everything sends okay, we actually can respond with a 200 status indicating that the push notification got sent, everything's fine. But if an error happens in this process as well, we can send back a 400 status code, which will actually show up as an error in our call to save the message. So in this way, we can understand the errors that are happening. So again, we have this completely integrated chain where the middle tier's communication with the application can communicate these errors back and forth, and you can choose to handle that appropriately. And then here, the last step is just actually kicking this off. Again, we're leveraging async to actually have some parallel tasks going on. So we're both updating the latest message and then getting the recipient information, which kicks off all of these methods. And then finally, when we get all of that done, we call the callback method, which will actually kick off sending the push notification. And you can see here that this actually works. So this took me a little bit of time to set up. It took me, a couple hours to sit down and, iron out all the bugs with this. But to get this up and running with push notifications didn't take nearly as long because you're not having to do things like, again, set up that abstraction or call an external service for doing push notifications that's maybe separate from your existing architecture. We could do all of this just by leveraging Convey. And it worked out well. I would actually do a live demo here, but it tends to do when I do demos of push notifications, they're always a little bit delayed, just solely because I'm on the development environment. Once you move to production, all that stuff works really, really well. So let's just talk a little bit about wrapping up, and then we'll jump into some questions. So we have two very different types of applications that we've gone over today. We've gone through an application that's more focused as an enterprise application that could be deployed for messaging internally and dealing with all the security constraints and difficulties that come with messaging apps. And then we're dealing with a totally consumer-focused app, no enterprise focus at all, for a small organization that just needed to be able to build something and innovate on it quickly. And so in both these cases, there was a use case for why Convey made sense for them. There was a use case for either just rapid innovation and being able to get up and move quickly, and then with the other, there was kind of more of a platform to build off of for all sorts of mobile experiences in the future. But in both cases, there was value for including an mBaaS solution. And as I mentioned, all of the code for the water cooler demo application is on GitHub, and you actually can get to it through this link here. And I'll let everyone copy that down if they want to. And then there's also a series of articles that I wrote on this that actually goes through the water cooler application, and you actually can get to those through this link here. And this was on Smashing Magazine. It included kind of an intro to mBaaS article, and then 2 articles that did an even further deep dive on the specifics that went into the water cooler application. So now that we've all had a chance to go through that, I'm curious if there are any questions that we want to dive into.
All right, thanks a lot, David. We have I think that we have some very impressed audience members asking if you're single.
Actually, I am not. I can answer that question.
Oh, sorry, folks. David is taken. All right, so I've got some other questions here. So first, do you think mBaaS is more suited for larger or smaller organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one we get asked a lot at our clients. The truth is that it's valuable for both, but for different reasons. I think if I look at startups or organizations that maybe are kind of reinventing themselves in kind of a digital transformation aspect, the advantage of Convey or any mBaaS solution is that it allows you to have that platform without having to wait to create it, without having to invest to create it. So instead, you can invest in a solution where on day one, you can build off of it. And then as you grow and you need to do things like maybe integrate with, using some of the auth link capability or using some of the data link capability, some of the more enterprise features of Convey, you can leverage those as you need them. You've got a path to that. Whereas if you start building your system from scratch, you might not consider some of those down the road steps. So for the smaller organization, there's a huge value because it's a platform that can grow with you, and it enables you to get started right away. For the larger organization, there's a huge value because what it does is it provides a standardization platform for that mobile engagement tier, so that if you have multiple vendors and multiple internal teams across separate business units all creating mobile applications, there's now a standard way to do things, right? So instead of having maybe this, 3 different ways that you're accessing the same piece of data across 3 different applications, now there's a standard way. Developers can now more easily move between teams and pick up on the same tasks and execute on them because they're not having to totally ramp up on a completely new way of doing things with every application. In addition, you can go to vendors and say, hey guys, here's how we build our mobile applications because we're leveraging Convey as a standard platform. And so I think, again, the benefits are different for large versus small organizations, but there's distinct value that's provided at both levels.
Excellent. So next question here is about the time that you saved. So it says, what do you think you gained from a time investment perspective by leveraging mBaaS for these examples?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think the one that it makes the most sense to look at with that is the UICA application. Obviously, the other was a demo application, but with the UICA app, again, I think it was substantial because if we had to build out a complete middle tier and data tier for that, we're certainly talking about some developers working for quite a bit of time, in probably over a month to get that up and running and fully tested. And again, it's not to say that that doesn't work in some scenarios, but again, then the moment you need to extend it to do something else, you've got to bring a team back in to do that. And in that case, we felt like we were doing some fairly standard things that Convey handles extremely well. And so it just made sense for us to jump in and leverage it there. So again, I think the time savings on an application like that was certainly substantial.
Excellent. So to follow on to that, how does this compare to just leveraging services from a cloud provider like Amazon Web Services?
Yeah, and that's another thing that we get asked a lot. And I think there's a place for each. I think there's some things that Amazon Web Services provides that are really great, but it still is going to require that you build some infrastructure on top of it, right? So they don't have these drop-in SDKs, that like Convey does, for example, for for JavaScript and for iOS and for Android that handle all of the communication to the server tier and enforce things like the permissions at the API layer. And so you kind of have to build out the infrastructure to then leverage their services. And again, maybe there's some cases where that totally makes sense, but if you're looking for a platform to build off of, having Convey that not only provides you that services and data layer, but also that client-side architecture layer for how all of that communication happens, then I think in those situations it makes more sense to leverage something like Convey.
All right. Now, just from kind of a resourcing perspective, a lot of companies tend to have resources available of one sort or another. So this question kind of fits in with that. Does this change the way that you build applications, or to what extent does it change the way that you're building these applications?
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly does. We deal with some applications that require us to staff several individuals kind of managing that middle tier and data tier, and in some situations that's we're building off of a client's existing infrastructure that isn't easily accessible, and so we've got to build out some pieces there, and so we'll certainly have more individuals. But in situations where we're building off of Convey, we certainly have probably the same number of engineers working on that client tier, but we don't have as many working on the back-end tier. So for clients that invest in that platform, it certainly is a reduction in the overall amount of resources that are on the ground, the overall resources that are needed to actually execute on that. So I think there's certainly a cost savings from the way that we resource it from that perspective. So it is a substantial difference. But again, that being said, it still still requires individuals that have a good understanding across all those tiers and how they interact. And that's an area where we certainly bring value.
Okay, great. Well, we are just about at time, so we're going to wrap it up. And for those questions that we didn't get to today, please feel free to drop us a line at webinars@convey.com, and we'll be happy to field any questions that you have there. The recording of this is going to be available in the next couple of days. If you wanted to share it, we'll be sending out an email, so keep a heads up for that. And David, thank you so much for sharing all of these incredible examples, and I think this is incredibly insightful, and we're very lucky to have you presenting to us, so thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody, for joining us.